Book 3, Part 2, Chapter 2. She doesn't seem to remember her own life at all, Elder John said when Reina and Phil took Reina into the other room to shift. He thumbed through his notes from the talk with her and nodded at his conclusion. Reina is still in shock, Sally snapped, standing next to her husband and glancing at the door. After all that poor pup has gone through, really, I'm amazed she has come out so well. Are you writing this down? She huffed, as the scribal elder bent over his paper again. Ryan walked over, glanced at the paper, lost interest, and turned to face the others in the room. Shock might be part of it, but she does seem to have forgotten that part of her life. He didn't look happy about that. Part of him had wished for this a few times. He nearly hated the vampires in her life now. But now that that possibility was real, he wasn't so excited about it. They'll think we did it to her, David stated, and Ryan gave a hard nod. How could we make her forget? Jackson hissed, and then winced when Reina's screams rattled the walls. The room went quiet until her cries calmed. Female werewolves had a harder time with the pain. Not because they were weaker, no, Wolf was dumb enough to think that, but their bodies took longer to shift, and it was more intense for them. One reason most females didn't shift very often. We couldn't even if we wanted to, Ryan stated, but do you think they'll believe that? Jackson's lip curled and he growled softly, "Superior race, my..." He didn't finish the statement when Sally sighed. "Are you going to talk to her about it?" she asked meekly, just as torn as the rest. "We should sit her down and ask her some questions," the third elder stated. "See if we can confirm whether it's shock or she really doesn't remember." "You like that thought, don't you?" Otis sniffed. The elders were always an odd bunch, respected but also avoided most of the time. They were very focused on their purpose of writing the pack's history. It was no secret that the elders had always had an interest in Reina. Her life story was already woven into their history through the elders' books and spread through their meets with other pack elders. But the excitement and hunger that flickered in their eyes now made the others uneasy. Brian shook his head. "Leave her alone for once," he said quietly, and Ryan turned to hide his smile. He enjoyed seeing how protective his pack was with each other. "We need to know," Elder John stated, completely unaffected by the attitudes in the room. He was used to it. He knew that the life of an elder meant to be a very special part of this pack, and also to be somewhat of an outsider. They were all well informed when they took their vows. Jackson stepped up next to Ryan. "Need to or want to?" "Enough," Ryan said, but in a casual tone. As much as he agreed with the others, they were losing their own focus. "I'll decide when and how we approach that subject. She's very fragile. Emotionally," he added when Jackson chuckled. "If she has forgotten and we force those memories back too fast, it could destroy her." Sally nodded. "It could." Her eyes watered and her husband moved next to her, putting his arm around her waist. "Yes, she could go mad," Elder John stated in a matter-of-fact tone, tapping his pen on his chest. "Not something we want to have happen, so we agree. Slow and careful is the best way." "Well, that settles it then," Otis whispered in a sarcastic voice. Elder Michael smiled. "We are not just here for the memoirs," he looked over his shoulder, "no matter what Elder John may say." Ryan sighed and Phil's father looked at him. "What she needs is something a bit closer to normal." The alpha nodded. Having her cooped up in these 2 small rooms was not something that sat well with him either. They were making plans to move her, but that would have to wait until it was dark enough to be safe for her. "When can they come home?" Natalie asked timidly, and the others all turned to Ryan, waiting for the answer to the question they had all wanted to ask. "I don't know," he stated, running a hand roughly through his thick hair. "It's not that simple." He looked around the room, again feeling the pressure of being alpha to such a large pack. He wouldn't trade it for the world, but there were times that he doubted himself, and this whole situation had made him do that more than ever. They heard barking from the other room, and Jackson smiled. "Can I shift too?" Ryan chuckled and went to reply when Elder Mike stepped up to the younger one. "Do you have a strong need to do that at this moment?" "What?" The elder watched him carefully and then repeated the question. Jackson tilted his head and then looked at Ryan. "That's a strange question to be asking a musking wolf," Ryan chuckled. "They would shift daily if it didn't finally make them sleep for a few days straight." Elder John stood, glancing at his colleagues, then turned back. "We are trying to find out if another part of the legend is true." Ryan crossed his arms. "Another part?" Elder Michael sighed, gave another hard look around, and then turned back to the pack alpha. "We found a few tellings of protectors, werewolves that become bound to the Aote couple." Ryan chuckled. "Jackson is part of her clique. He has always been very protective of her. He wants to shift so he can go play with her, not stand guard over her." Jackson nodded, but Elder John shook his head, his eyes serious but hungry at the same time. "No, bound protectors are much more than that." His eyes sparkled with excitement. "They get to experience a part of the Aote. They are bound to the couple nearly as deep as the couple is bound to each other." His voice took on a surreal tone of a storyteller, his hands gesturing slowly around the room. "It is said that when a bonded couple is created, protectors will be appointed to them through the same magic." "Stop there," Ryan said in a low, hard voice, uncrossing his arms. "I used that word once, and it made them take her away. This is not magic. It's—" He frowned. "It may seem magical only because it's so rare, but there is no magic at work here. This is real. We can't use terms like that, even here." The room fell quiet again, and Elder John finally sighed and returned to the table and his papers. "So, can I shift?" Jackson whispered, and Ryan smiled, thankful for even a little comic relief. When he nodded, Jackson slapped his hands together happily and then glanced around the room. Shifting with other wolves wasn't something that didn't affect him, but they did like to have some privacy. He glanced at Sally and Natalie and blushed a little. Maybe later," he sighed. Sally gave a soft laugh, having 4 boys and a husband that shifted often. "If you go behind that last bed and we turn our backs, you should have plenty of privacy." That put the smile back on his face, and he trotted over to the farthest bed. The others turned and moved back to give him some space. His shift took only a quarter of the time it took Reina, and it was nearly soundless. When the soft brown wolf stepped out from behind the bed, he shook himself hard and then gave a happy bark. There was a reply bark from the other room, and he rushed over to the door and whimpered, lifting a paw and scratching at it. The door opened a little, and Track's head popped out, then looked down. "Sorry, no dogs allowed," he huffed playfully, then grunted when Jackson rushed the door and ran through. Track rubbed his chest and looked at Ryan. The alpha nodded, but when Track continued to look at him, he walked to the door. "He can hear her," he whispered, trying to keep his voice low enough so all the others couldn't listen in. Ryan's brows lowered and Track nodded. "Just like me and—" he glanced over his shoulder. "Just like I can," he corrected himself quickly. The alpha turned to the others. "I'll be right back." "Would you mind if I—" was all Elder John got out when Ryan stepped into the other room and shut the door behind him. He laughed as he saw Jackson and Reina at a game of squaring off. Phil stood from the bed, smiling as well. Ryan walked over and gestured back to the bed, and Phil took his seat again. The alpha noticed that Track stayed by the door. Guarding it, he thought. He blinked a few times as he processed the situation, then turned to Phil. "You can hear her?" he said, also keeping his voice low. Phil smiled and nodded. There was a growl and then a grunt, and they both turned to see the smaller black wolf pinning the larger one. "That is something," Ryan whispered. Just then the black wolf hopped off her victim, trotted over, and pushed her head under Ryan's hand. He smiled and rubbed her between the ears. "She says it feels good to get some kind of exercise," Phil chuckled, and the wolf yelped as Jackson came up and nipped her hind leg. "As soon as the sun is down," Ryan stated, ignoring the play. "They were wolves. It's what they did." Phil glanced down. "It's only about noon." The black wolf whimpered, then turned and rushed at the other wolf, who tripped over the rug trying to dodge the sudden attack. Ryan looked up at his clique leader, still in awe of all that had happened. His mind spun back a few months, to when things were so routine he remembered being a bit bored. His shoulders shook with the thought, and he laced his hands together as he leaned forward. "Any new developments other than mind reading?" Phil knew what he was being asked and shook his head. She still hadn't mentioned her other life. Ryan drew in a slow breath and nodded. "That will have to be addressed sooner or later," he stated, giving the other a look, saying that it probably should be sooner. Jackson yelped and Track laughed. "She got you again. You're getting your tail whooped by a pup." Then Track knelt, crouched, and was slammed to the ground by the larger wolf. Reina charged, and Ryan called out to her just as she leapt onto the pile. He and Phil stood quickly, and sure enough, she cried out in pain when she landed and was consumed by the tangle of body parts. Jackson and Track froze, and then quickly pulled out from around her. Track stayed kneeling and then cursed under his breath. "It's bleeding again," he hissed in a self-loathing whisper. In the other room, Phil's father was on the phone, finishing the arrangements to move them. Natalie and Sally sat on one of the beds, their heads together to keep their voices from being overheard. The elders sat at the table, reviewing their notes and talking amongst themselves. David walked between the groups, though he gave the women their space. He had made a few calls to help with the move as well. A few more temporary moves until they figured out what would be done on a more permanent basis. They still had the vampires to contend with, and the fact that Reina didn't seem to recall that part of her life made that all the harder to plan for. When the others came back with the food, they set it up, and then Rock and Marcus went to let the ones in the next room know. David watched the elders, who were scribbling, whispering, and watching them back. He sighed and then smiled when the door opened and two wolves trotted out first. The larger one tried to nose her back, but the space was cramped and he only succeeded in getting himself lodged between legs. Rock frowned and looked at Ryan. "Can I shift too?" he said, almost whining. Ryan smiled. Rock and Jackson were like twins born to different families. He remembered the sensation when Phil and Reina bonded and looked around the room. Track was there, so was Rock, Jackson, Marcus, and himself. Then he glanced at the others and recalled the story of the bound protectors. That clique was always extremely close, and they doted on Reina from the beginning. But was there something more now? And if so, why wasn't he affected? He sighed and stepped over the larger wolf as it squirmed through the people. Ryan looked at Marcus, whose eyes were darting between the black wolf and Phil. When he looked at Track, who was pulling food out of the bag, he noticed that his body was positioned so he could still see most of the room. Am I completely paranoid? He thought to himself. Well, boss? Ryan blinked and turned to see Rock standing there. When he gave a quick nod, Rock jumped and turned. You just wait, he laughed, pointing at the larger wolf. Then he trotted into the other room. The Alpha started to analyze the possibility. That group was extremely close as it was, but he needed to now know if it went further than that. He took a step forward, acting like he was listening to a conversation, and he put himself between Track and the black wolf. With the others in the room, Track wouldn't be able to see her now. She was laying on the ground, growling playful threats at Jackson. Ryan watched Reina's best friend as he set out a few sandwiches and then turned. Track tilted his head and then arched his neck to try to see past him. Ryan changed his position again slightly. Track's hand stopped in midair, a bag of chips in it. I could just be paranoid, Ryan thought to himself again. Then he called David over, and when the man walked up, they created a large barrier. So, what do you know of the legends? The Alpha asked Track's father, although he watched the man's son carefully from the corner of his eye. Not any more than you do now, I would think, David said, then put his arms out to catch his balance as Jackson bumped into his leg when Rock tackled him. Track shot from the table and pushed past the others. Be careful, he snapped, glaring down at his friends. We just had to bandage her up again. The two bigger wolves froze, their large bodies mangled together as they wrestled. Ryan watched Track's eyes widen and his head whipped around. Where is she? He whispered, although his voice was tight. Ryan put his hand on the other's shoulder and Track turned to him quickly, his jaw tight. Ryan's brows lifted and Track blinked hard and then let his stance relax a bit. She's right over there, the Alpha stated slowly, pointing to the area between the two beds. Track looked over and saw her sitting there with Phil and the two women on the beds next to her. He gave a slow sigh of relief, nodded, and walked back over to the bags of food. Ryan rubbed his chin in thought, and David nodded. How can we tell? It would be impossible with my son. He has always been the most protective of her. Ryan gave a chuckle, feeling a bit silly for buying into the older wolf's tale. True. Rock and Jackson would only be slightly easier to judge, and that's not saying much, David smiled, shaking his head. Marcus, Ryan whispered, and David's brows dipped. The other nodded, dropping his voice to a careful whisper. He was in the room when it happened. So were you. True, but I am the pack alpha. Maybe it's different for me because of that. Well, Marcus is new to the pack, calmer, quieter. David smiled, amazed he was even contemplating this. If that part is true too, he would be the best one to test the theory on. Just then a phone rang. The room went silent, except for the muffled grunts of the two larger wolves as they wrestled in one corner. Ryan walked over to the nightstand and looked at the light blinking on the hotel phone. He frowned as he picked it up. He didn't have to quiet everyone first. They were all still and watching him. "Hello," he stated in a low, calm voice. His heart started to pound as he listened to the person on the other end. Everyone in the room sensed it, and he could smell the adrenaline rushing through them. "Thank you," he finally said, and hung up. When he turned, all eyes were on him, even the wolves who had stopped their playing and were sitting watching him. He glanced down at the smaller black one, then looked through the faces of the others until he settled on two. "Sally, Natalie, you will take Reina into the other room." It wasn't a question, and the two women quickly stood. The black wolf gave a small bark but trotted through the door. Ryan reached out and touched Sally's arm when she passed. "Pack up," he whispered. Her eyes widened, but she nodded, squaring her shoulders as she left. When the doors closed, he faced the others. That was the desk clerk. Someone called looking for a group of wolves, with one very specific female. Several moans rang out, and Track stepped up, his eyes tight. "Do they know?" Ryan shrugged. "We aren't waiting to find out. We're moving now." "But the call," Elder Michael stated, though he and the other two started to pack up their precious books and pads. "A wolf working the desk," Ryan stated. "But the vampires have put out a reward for information, and that can change a man's loyalties quickly." "He's not a pack wolf?" David asked, also starting to gather things and shove them into the bags that the others pulled out of drawers. "No," was all Ryan said, which made them all move faster. A pack wolf, even if not from their pack, had loyalty built in. A rogue wolf, with no pack at all, was not used to the ties that bind their kind. These days it rarely mattered, but in this situation, it made all the difference. "Aren't we forgetting something?" Marcus stated, with two half-filled bags in his hand. "We can't take her outside." Ryan cracked his neck. "We have no choice." Then he looked at Track. "You brought her bag?" "Yeah, it has her stuff and her sunshield blanket, but Ryan..." "They were made for emergencies, and this is one. Get it. Now." His voice vibrated at the end, and Track turned and knelt at the end of one of the beds. He reached under and yanked hard, freeing a black backpack. "She always left this at my house, just in case," he stated quietly, looking down at it as his heart pounded in his chest. Ryan took the bag and unzipped it. Inside was a large but thin black blanket. "This is made of a special fabric. It will block the sun," he said, not sure who he was trying to convince. "But if one shred of light gets in there," Marcus put in, now standing next to Track. Ryan nodded. "Then we better make sure it doesn't." "Maybe we are better off here," Elder Mike stated, stepping over to Ryan, a large duffel bag filled with notepads in one hand. "The vampires have already called here. They will move on down the list." "No," Ryan said firmly, turning and gesturing to the others that were still scooping up their things. "That rogue will be chewing his tail over that reward. He isn't working at this hotel because it's his lifelong dream." Aaron shrugged. "We don't have any closed cars." Track cussed under his breath. "I should have snuck over and snatched her car. I have an extra key," he shrugged when they all looked at him. "Too late for that now," David stated. "Polson is 4 hours in one direction we don't want to go." "We move on to the next point, just a little earlier," Ryan nearly growled, though his anger was not directed at anyone in the room. Aaron gave a quick nod and had a phone to his ear. "How are we going to keep the sun from her in a moving car?" Track snapped, as he reached over and pulled out the odd blanket. His heartbeat was up, but so was the others. Phil's face was tight. "They're counting on flushing us out." Ryan nodded. "Agreed, but we don't have a choice. We need to get to a place where we stand a better chance of..." He turned and looked at the closed door. We're leaving. The scouts haven't reported anything, and the vampires may have closed cars, but they can't jump out and fight us in the daylight." Phil picked up one end of the blanket and rubbed it between his fingers. The material was very thin, slightly shiny, and felt almost moist, although it was completely dry. "Are you sure this will keep her safe?" Track lowered his head and gave a slight shrug. "She never had to use it." The room went quiet again. Ryan sighed and then shook his head. "Her father put that in there, so we'll trust it. The man is obsessed with his daughter. He wouldn't have given it to her if it hadn't been tested." He clapped his hands and everyone turned and continued packing. Ryan looked at Phil. "You holding up?" "I'm not thrilled about leaving it up to that to keep her safe," he stated, dropping the flimsy blanket that Track still had clutched in his hand. Rock and Jackson trotted over and looked up. Ryan nodded, and they hurried over to the far side of the room to shift. "Better to have them on two legs right now," he explained, then turned. "Brian, contact the scouts. I want a set staying back to watch that desk clerk." The other gave a sharp nod, pulling his phone out. "Phil, Track, and—" Ryan paused. "You two go talk to Reina. Tell her we're leaving." Track frowned. "What if she asks why?" "She won't," Phil stated, then shrugged when the others gave him a hard look. "She'll go where I go." There was no arrogance in his statement, and he actually seemed a little embarrassed. Ryan blinked hard, looked towards the door, and then gave a nod. "Okay, we're out in 5. Have her ready." Phil and Track went into the other room, and Ryan turned to David. "We're going to have to carry her, wrapped up tight. There is no way she can trot out of here and stay covered." "Not an easy task," the other stated, "but I agree." "What if we put her in something?" They turned to see Elder John standing, holding his own duffel bag and another filled with food. "If we had a box or something, we could put her in that, cover her, and carry it out." He shrugged when the others kept staring. "Would look a little less like carrying a wolf." Ryan chuckled. "Rock, Jackson, go see if you can get a box big enough." They maneuvered through the bodies and headed out the front door, glancing at the one between the two rooms before leaving. Brian closed his phone. "Cars are ready. 2 will stay back. 2 are heading out to watch up front." "We need to reduce our numbers," Ryan said, talking out loud to himself. He looked around the room. "We're too many right now." "But you need all of us," Elder Michael stated, suddenly nervous he was going to miss out. Ryan shrugged. "Yes, but not in the way you think." A few minutes later, Rock and Jackson returned with a large box, the name of an appliance store printed on the sides. The main alpha glanced around the room again, then called out to Track. When he came into the room, Ryan faced them all. "This is how it's going to work." The alpha vibrations in his voice kept them all from arguing when he told them their plan, but it didn't keep their body language from showing how they felt about it. He drew in a long, slow breath after, watching the faces that looked back at him. They would follow him in his orders, not only because he was their alpha, because they trusted him. Again he felt the weight of his position heavy around his neck. "What if I fail?" he thought, then growled at himself. "That is not an option," he hissed back at himself, and then squared his shoulders. "Track, Phil, Rock, and Jackson will ride with me, Reina with us," he stated, stealing a quick glance at David. Marcus shifted on his feet. His eyes moved towards the closed door and then back. The pack alpha and Track's dad watched out of the corner of their eyes. "I would like to come with you," the newest member of the pack stated, again looking at the door between the rooms. "That would be 6 of us, and her," Ryan said slowly, watching the other carefully. "That's a pretty tight fit." He kept the vibration out of his voice. He wanted to see how far Marcus would push it. "We can manage it," Track stated, and the Alpha tilted his head a little. Marcus was part of their clique, but he was still new. "We need everyone to spread out," David put in slowly, also watching the other two. "Agreed," Track replied, stepping up next to his packmate. "But we need Marcus with us." "Why?" David asked his son, feeling his own skin prickle a bit. Could that part of the legend also be true? If so, what did it mean? Track also fidgeted. "Well, he's strong and smart." Track looked at Marcus, who gave him a thankful smile. Ryan's brows lifted. "Phil is smart, and you, Rock, and Jackson have plenty of muscle." He smiled, but noticed the three in front of him weren't smiling back. "I think we should take Marcus," Rock stated, with Jackson nodding next to him. "I can fight," Marcus said. They all turned to Marcus, who stepped up. "I fought before." The elders were watching as closely as David and Ryan were, and for the same reasons. Elder John reached into his bag, but stopped when Elder Michael shook his head softly. David put his hand on Marcus's shoulder. "We can put you in a car close behind. That should—" "No," Track stated in a low tone. "He has to be with us." Elder John smiled, and the third elder shook his head but was grinning as well. "Why?" David asked, watching the boys carefully. Marcus turned and looked at him. "I think they were right about protectors," he stated in a matter-of-fact tone. "So you feel compelled to be with with Ryan and Phil," Elder Michael said, still smiling. Marcus looked at his clique members, then nodded slowly. Track gave another nod. "So do I." Rock and Jackson admitted the same, and Ryan rolled his neck until it cracked. As amazing as the possibility was, it could also cause problems. How strong was this need to protect the two? Was it stronger than pack? Was it deeper than common sense? There was a small bark from the other side of the door, and they all turned. "She wants to know when we're leaving," Track stated. "Is she worried?" Aaron asked, his hand covering the phone at his ear. Track chuckled. "No, she just wants the heck out of here." David gave a soft laugh. "She needs to stretch her legs." Ryan ran a hand through his hair. "Unfortunately, it will be a while before we can let her." The smiles fell, and finally the Alpha gave a nod. "Okay, drivers head down, the rest of you pack it up. Track, you and your crew stay here and get ready for transport." Again the Alpha smiled, trying to lighten things with some humor, but the younger ones only nodded, their faces serious. When the room was finally empty of everyone else, Ryan looked towards the door and nodded. Track walked over and opened it. Only Phil and Reina walked out. The others had already left through the other door. "Not sure how this is any less obvious," Track stated as they lifted her into the box. "Two other boxes have left in other cars," Ryan stated, and they all looked at him. He smiled. "This may be my first war, but it's not my first battle." That finally got smiles and chuckles out of the others as he shook out the blanket. "Reina, lay down and be still," he stated, and then reached in and wrapped the blanket around her. Phil walked out first, the other four carrying the box, and Ryan took up the rear. When they reached the stairs, their cargo shifted and slid to one side. Track grunted as he fought to keep a hold of the front, and Jackson snapped at Rock. "Steady down, pups," Ryan said in a low voice. The sun was bright now, past noon, but still high in the sky, and his eyes darted everywhere. Rock lowered his end of the box, and Track lifted his. A door at the end of the hallway opened, and a man about Ryan's age peeked out. "Got a lot going on there." The Alpha looked over, visually sizing up the other. The man was an inch shorter, but thick. His eyes moved from him to the box and then back. Ryan felt his hackles go up. "Books can be heavy," he stated back, making direct eye contact. The other man looked him up and down and finally gave a small nod. "So I've heard." Then the door shut. Ryan cursed under his breath and followed the others down the staircase. They could have taken the elevator, but it was more likely to be populated in the middle of the day. The less eyes that could try to claim that reward, the better. When they finally reached the parking lot, Phil stepped out of the SUV and opened the back doors. The seats were limousine style, facing each other, and they tried to cram the box into the spaces between them. "It's not going to fit," Track snapped as one corner nearly ripped on the door. Ryan moved up and shook his head. "Put it in the back." "The back?" Track, Marcus, Rock, and Jackson all gasped. Phil stepped up, his own face worried. Ryan gave a low growl, and someone popped the lock on the back. Ryan moved around and lifted the hatch. The four others grumbled, but quickly moved around. The box slid easily into the back. Phil went to climb in, but Ryan grabbed his arm. "Why would you ride in the back with a box full of books?" he whispered, and Phil sighed. Everyone climbed into the SUV quickly. As soon as the doors were closed, Phil and Track hopped over the seat. Rock jumped into the driver's seat. Ryan went up front with him. Jackson and Marcus sat in the seats closest to the cargo area. Ryan turned and watched, again wondering if having his wolves bound to them was a threat to his authority. So far they had listened, but what would happen if he gave them an order that went against their possible new allegiance? How strong was this new bond? How much of it was aote? The car pulled out and Ryan lifted his phone and pushed a button. Phil looked at the box. "She needs air." Marcus reached into his back pocket and pulled out a large pocket knife, then held it out. Ryan looked over the seat. "Keep the holes at the bottom and stab 'em upward." Phil leaned down. "Reina, scoot to one side. We need to make air holes." There was a shuffling inside and then a small bark. Phil took the knife, leaned farther down, and shoved it through the thick cardboard. Stabbing upwards meant that the cardboard would push out at the top of the hole and create a lip over it. Track watched him and then glanced at the windows. "We need a closed car," he grumbled, looking around for something to cover the windows with. They were deeply tinted, but with ordinary tint, not the special stuff that vampires use to protect themselves from the sun. After Phil made 5 holes on the bottom, he folded the knife and handed it back to Marcus. A phone beeped, and Track straightened and pulled his personal one out of his pockets. "Hey, Ryan, it's a bat call," he nearly hissed from the back. The Alpha turned and reached out. Track handed the phone over to Phil, who glanced at the screen, and then handed it to Marcus, who handed it to Ryan. "So, how far are we going?" Jackson asked, adjusting his large body sideways on the seat. "Hopefully, far enough," Ryan stated, tossing the phone back to him. He nodded and handed it back to Track. Phil put his hand on the top of the box and then smiled when there was a thump underneath it. Chapter 3. It was stifling in that box, and I couldn't move more than a few inches in any direction. The blanket was tangled around me now, and I was panting hard. The only thing that kept me from freaking completely out was the smell of my packmates and knowing that Phil was only inches away. We'd been driving for a long time, and my fur was soaked with sweat. I laid down and stuck my nose up against the hole to get fresh air. The ride was unnervingly quiet, and I could smell the tension from the others. I didn't quite understand what we were doing or why, but for some reason, I didn't care. Phil said we needed to go, so I went. My heart had found its other half. All of those greeting card cliches now seemed almost crass in comparison. I would follow him anywhere, and was thankful to him for taking on whatever this burden was. Moving me during the day was a hard thing, but they didn't complain. Finally, the heat started to make my head pound, and I panted harder. My muscles twitched to tell me I needed more air, and soon the cardboard under me was soaked with sweat. "We have to get her out," Phil snapped, his voice tight and worried. I gave a small, supportive bark, trying to tell him I could manage a little longer, no matter what my body said. I heard Ryan say something, but I was panting so hard I couldn't make it out. The heat was miserable, and I shifted my weight as the cardboard under me was soaking through. "When you try to lift me out of here," I thought so Phil and Track could hear me, "the bottom is going to fall right out." I gave a chuckle at the end to soften the news, since their heartbeats quickened. One of the air holes at the bottom tore, and I shoved my nose through it, grateful for even this small relief. Suddenly, the ride became bumpy, and I yelped as I actually bounced inside. "Take it easy on the bumps," I heard Track snap, and then Rock made some comment back. The SUV slowed down a bit, but the bumps were increasing. Suddenly, I was tossed against one side of the box, and I felt somebody grab it to keep it from tipping. I yelped again and flattened myself on the bottom to try to keep steady. Another large bump threw me the other way, and I felt a sharp pain in my side. Track and Phil both yelled at Rock, and I felt them push against the box to hold it still. I moaned as a mix of heat, lack of air, and extreme motion started to quease my stomach. I finally closed my eyes and tried to steady my breathing, leaning forward to find the larger air hole. Finally, the car stopped, and my ears perked as I heard a door open. "Hang in there," came Phil's voice, and I had to smile. The sound was like a cool breeze, and I lifted my nose and inhaled. He chuckled then, and I barked back at him happily. I may be lying here in a pool of my own sweat, gasping for air, but I was so incredibly happy that it didn't seem to matter much. Phil would find a way. I trusted him, not only with my life, but with my soul. I heard voices outside the car, but couldn't make out what they were saying. I was panting so hard that I could barely hear the others that were inside with me. The car started to move again, and I groaned. Brave or not, I wasn't sure how much more of this I could take. My legs were twitching, muscle spasms were not a good sign. I heard something scraping against the side of the vehicle, and I felt my head start to spin. "That's it," I heard Jackson yell, and we came to a stop. The box shifted a bit, and then the top started to open. I shoved my head through it and gasped for air, like a swimmer that had been under the water too long. "Crap! Look at her!" Track snarled, and I turned my head towards him, my tongue flopping out as I gulped down the cool, fresh air. "She's soaked and foaming. She's overheated." I barked to tell him it wasn't that bad, but he reached in and put his hand between my front legs. "Her heart is going a mile a minute," he snapped, then pulled his wet hand back and glared at it. Okay, so there was a little froth on there, but I'd be fine now. "Well, move your butt and let's get her out of there," Rock responded in a tight tone. I turned, and Phil smiled at me, but I saw the worry in his eyes. "Hop on out," was all he was able to say before I jumped, part of the box crumbling under me. When I landed, I gave a huge yawn. I wasn't tired. My muscles just needed to wake up. The car was dark, and so was the area outside the door. I stopped panting as hard, lifted my nose, and sniffed. "Warehouse," he stated. I snorted a nod, and then the back hatch was open. I leapt out before it was all the way up. Wow, the air felt great, even with the dust kicking up everywhere. I trotted in a circle, then in a bigger one, letting my legs work out the kinks. The others were talking, but I ignored it and stopped, shaking myself hard. The wetness flew everywhere, and I barked in triumph. I was still wet, but no longer dripping, and that was a great feeling too. "Here, drink up." I looked up as Track knelt in front of me, placing a large bowl on the ground. I went to gulp down the water, but he pulled it away, shaking his head. "Slow it down, or you'll be sorry." He pushed the bowl back, and I took a few large laps, enjoying the sensation as it went down my throat. Jackson squatted next to him. "We have a few towels to dry you off some." Go for it, I thought, busy quenching my thirst, and only grunted a little as they rubbed me down. "Can I have some more?" I thought, after licking the last drops of moisture out. Track smiled and shoved the bowl at Jackson. I snorted again, to get the water off my muzzle, then turned and looked around. This was a very old, very abandoned building. There were crates and barrels tossed in corners that were so covered in dust you couldn't tell their true color. Ryan was talking on his cell phone, but he felt my stare and turned, giving me a quick smile. My mouth opened and my tongue flopped out in response. Then my tail started kicking up more dust. Track batted at the air, and I stopped. Phil walked over, and I took a step towards him, rubbing against his chest when he knelt down. He smiled and ran a hand over my back, which made my body tingle. I pushed against his chest harder, and he fell backwards, kicking up a cloud of dust as he landed. "Sorry about that," I thought. He chuckled, righted himself, and brushed his hands off. "Don't be. I like seeing you happy." Oh, there went my heart again, only it wasn't racing because I was about to pass out from heat stroke. I stepped closer to him, my eyes watching him. In some ways it was so odd to have the sensation of two hearts beating inside of me. Yet in other ways it was like I was only half alive before. His smile was so familiar now, like my soul finally found what I didn't even know I had been looking for. I closed my eyes and inhaled his scent slowly, letting it fill me and course through every inch of me. How sad it was that I had actually thought what I had before was a life. "This," I whimpered softly, "this is how life was meant to be." When I opened my eyes, those brown ones smiled back at me, but told me so much more. I took another step, looking directly into them. There was no place he would go that I wouldn't follow. There was no day that could pass that I could be away from him. Our hearts beat for each other now, two halves now whole. "I love you," I whispered with my mind, and felt another wave crash over me. It rippled through the air, which seemed to shiver in response. He leaned even closer, placing his mouth next to my ear. I closed my eyes, feeling his breath on my fur. "I love you too." My heart caught for a split second, and then it raced to make up for it. When he leaned back, I saw a tear fall and roll slowly down his cheek and over his smiling lips. Another soft whimper came from me, and I moved closer, rubbing my jaw against his chest. I closed my eyes as his arms wrapped around my neck. This was not just true love. It was so much more. "Aote," he whispered again, his voice vibrating against my cheek. I smiled and then lifted my head and howled. The air seemed still afterwards, as if holding its breath. I smiled inside, and his dimple glistened under another tear. My chest rose and fell hard, and then I heard a sound to the side of me. Still floating on my cloud, I turned and then blinked. I tilted my head and let my surroundings sink in. I had forgotten where we were. In fact, I had forgotten that anything else even existed. I tilted my head the other way, seeing Jackson. His large frame seemed odd in my world. My head tilted the other way, and the waves slowly ebbed. It didn't hurt when they rolled out. The love was still there, but I was able to grasp what I was seeing. Jackson shifted, and I noticed his face was flushed. Another sound, and I turned again. Phil's hand slowly moving off my neck. Rock, even larger than the other, looked down at his feet, the light glistening off his wet cheeks. I arched my neck and whimpered, not wanting him to be sad. He smiled at me, and I gave a happy bark. Seems Aote doesn't just affect us, Phil whispered, a smile in his voice. Track took a step, the small cloud of dust at his feet. His dark eyes were wet too, and his cheeks were warm. My brows wrinkled, and then Ryan stepped into my view. I looked up at him. His face was so full of emotion, and his eyes were still trying to process it all. He ran a hand over his handsome face, and I barked softly at him, my tail kicking up more dust. "I'm not sure I even know what to say," he finally stated, his voice low and full of emotion. He cleared his throat and then ran his hand through his hair. "I think I need to look at the elders' books a little more." The warehouse fell quiet again, all eyes on Phil and I. "Is something wrong?" I thought, turning to look up at Phil, who still wore a soft smile. He put his hand on the base of my neck. "Not sure you could call it wrong," he stated, looking up at Ryan. "But I think they are somehow experiencing when we..." My eyes widened, and I turned to look back. Marcus was standing there now, his eyes also moist and his face flushed. "Why? How?" I asked. The moment this had all started, everyone in the pack felt it, but this was just a look between Phil and I. How could they have sensed that? Ryan's phone rang and we all jumped. I chuckled inside, since it was usually pretty hard to startle this group. Me? Well, I was just jumpy. Our alpha reached into his pocket, his hand shaking, and pulled out the phone, quickly pushing the button and putting it to his ear. I turned my attention to Track. "What did you feel?" I asked, and Phil looked up at him as well. Track looked at the other three and shrugged. "I don't know if I could explain it if you held a gun to my head," he said in a low voice. Rock nodded, and Jackson stepped up next to my best friend. Whatever it was like Mom's homemade stew after a really hard run on a biting cold day. He glanced around the area again and then shrugged. "Only about 10 times better." Marcus nodded. "It's like someone suddenly turned on the lights," he glanced around. "Like the colors and smells that we're used to are just a fraction of their true potential, and when you two..." He looked back at us and then shrugged. "I could see and smell 100 times more intensely." He bit the side of his lip, then crammed his hands in his jean pockets. "That doesn't do it justice, but..." Rock smiled. "So why do we... when you... and what exactly did you two..." He stuttered, looking excited and uncomfortable at the same time. "I have no idea," Phil smiled. He looked at me and then stood, looking at the others. Ryan said something into the phone, then turned and waited, listening too. I stepped up next to his leg, rubbing against it. He smiled. "It's like you said. I can see colors in a way I've never seen before. Food tastes different, amazing. Even things I've eaten 100 times, I can..." He rubbed his chin. I can savor it now. His hand reached down and rested on my back. Then there are times when she looks at me a certain way. He blew out his breath. It's like even that explodes 100-fold, and then everything stands still or goes away. He shrugged. I can see, smell, and feel every detail around us. It's like I can focus on all of it at the same time, even though I am still... He blushed a little. Lost in the moment, he shrugged. Contradiction, I know, but... I blinked hard and he looked down at me. I'm not aware of anything else. It's like everything else just disappears, and it's just you and me, I thought, and Track whispered to the others. She's vulnerable when it happens, Ryan stated, suddenly not looking happy. But I could hear each of your hearts beating, Phil stated, smiling. I heard every breath you each took and knew where you stood. I was consumed by her, but also knew everything that was going on around us. When we all stared at him, he nodded. It started to rain the moment it happened. I blinked hard and turned. There were no windows here, which is why they brought me here, but I tilted my head and listened. By the looks on their faces, the others were doing the same. The walls here were thick, and even with our wolf ears couldn't make any sound from outside. Marcus jogged over to a door and opened it a bit. It didn't go outside, but he shoved his head through. It's pouring out, he stated, when he turned back around, shutting it behind him. Again, we all stared at Phil. He chuckled. Like I said, she took up every inch of my heart, but my other senses fanned out and stood point, Jackson whispered, his eyes wide. Phil chuckled. I guess that's one way to put it. There was a sound from Ryan's phone, and he blinked hard, then put it back up to his ear, walking a few yards away. So, am I even more of a freak now? I asked, feeling their eyes still on us. Phil ran his hand over my back. I guess we are. We? Jackson stepped up. So is what we felt... How do you do that? No idea, Phil stated, taking in a deep breath and standing a little taller. There just seems to be a look or a moment that... And we feel it because we're right here? Rock asked, quietly, still blinking a bit slower. I think it's more than that, Marcus stated, looking at me and Phil. I think the elders were right. I saw Track swallow hard, and I barked. Right about what? Bonded protectors, Phil whispered. Not to keep from being heard, just simply out of awe. Bonded what? I barked, and Marcus walked over and knelt in front of me. His long lashes blinked over his green eyes. They said that an Ote couple takes a U-turn, Ryan stated, and we all looked over at him. He shoved his phone in his pocket, gave Marcus a sharp look that made him stand up quickly. Changing plans. Where to then? Rock asked. His body language said he was ready to be out of here. The Owl-Saw Pack. I glanced at the others and noticed they didn't seem to recognize the name either. But Phil took a step up. Owl-Saw? Ryan nodded. It'll be getting dark in an hour. We leave then. My wolf took another step. So, they really exist? Now that got our attention. I barked and the others stepped up, looking at the head alpha. He sighed and nodded. Yes, and they have had experience with... His eyes moved to Phil, down to me, and back to Phil again. They made contact and are expecting us. I felt Phil's emotions change from calm to excited with a bit of nervousness. Why would this pack make him edgy, and what did he mean they really exist? Jackson's eyes widened. Wait, he danced a little in place. My Gammy, she told me a few stories. He looked over at Rock, his own eyes wide. Remember the one about the pack that lives deep in the woods and rarely ever comes out? Rock went to shake his head, but then stopped. You mean the one where the wolves there live longer than most and hide their secrets as well as their location? Jackson looked at Ryan, chuckling. Those are only just stories, right? Right, Ryan stated, suddenly looked irritated. And so is Aote. The room fell quiet again, and I finally sat down. Phil glanced down at me, but spoke to his alpha. Is it safe there? Ryan ran both hands through his hair. They made the contact, Phil, he stated, starting to pace. They have never, ever, but they did. They are offering us a place to stay for now. He stole a quick glance at me. Conditions are, we still won't know where they are. Huh? Jackson cracked, his head tilted. The Alpha gave a hard nod. We will meet at one location, and they will pick us up and take us the rest of the way. Not to sound suspicious, Track stated, but doesn't that sound more like a trap? Ryan drew in a long breath. From any other source, yes. But they have talked to the elders and... He looked at Phil and shrugged. They're going to leave collateral here to show good faith. Excuse me? Phil stated, and I smelled the worry on him. I stepped up and pushed my side against his leg. His hand came down and rested on my back. David, Aaron, and the elders will be at the meeting point too. The Alpha and 3 others will be there, and they'll leave... Ryan shook his head as if he couldn't believe what he was about to say. 5 females. 2 are with pup. I barked hard and the others gasped. 5 females? 2 pregnant? These wolves were either completely insane or extremely sincere. Werewolves protected their females fiercely, and pregnant ones were coveted even more. I don't understand, I barked. Ryan nodded. They have their ways, was all he said. The room fell quiet again, and the others paced around the large room. Phil sat down, and I sat next to him, all of us busy with our own thoughts. Fairy tales were crashing into reality, and our minds were racing to try to grasp it all. I had never heard of this pack, neither had Track. Rock and Jackson had only heard a few stories, and Marcus seemed as shocked. Ryan knew enough to be pacing more than the rest of us. His eyes moved everywhere, and his scent made us all a bit tense. While the Alpha paced, the rest of us watched his back. Then my stomach decided to break the silence and growled, loudly. I moaned when they all stopped and looked at me. Phil, who still sat next to me, chuckled. Sounds like the dinner bell to me. I barked playfully, and he gave a nod and stood, trying to brush the coating of dust off him. He only succeeded in smearing it into his jeans. He looked at his hands and then glanced down at me. I turned my head and snorted. I was no better. I was dry now, but the dust clung to my fur and was caked in spots. I braced my legs and gave a good hard shake. There was a slight pain in my side, but it was forgotten as soon as I was done. Her bandage is filthy, Track stated, and Ryan walked over and looked at me. No sense changing it here, he glanced around, but we'll have to get her cleaned up. Then he chuckled as he realized they were all covered in some degree of the aged dust. Food then? Marcus asked, and I barked my reply. He smiled and headed towards the door. Ryan gave Jackson a look, and he followed out. My stomach growled again, and Track shook his head. Remind us not to take you into hiding without feeding you first. The Alpha gave him a fierce look, and he shrank back. I just meant that her stomach is growling so loud that... He sighed and didn't finish the statement. Sorry, I whimpered, and Track winked. No worries. I was getting hungry too. And that's where I'm going to stop.